This is, I guess I project really loudly with this microphone. So I apologize for being very loud this morning. So we're all here together to, Okay, good. We'll just keep it rolling. Okay, so I'm here today with you to explore these ideas about how we can understand how games matter and how we can use games in our work with young people. How, as young people, we play games. How, as old people, we play games. What do games mean to us? And this phrase that comes up a lot in the Games for Change community or in the game development community is this idea of meaningful play. That our technologies, the storytelling and mechanics generally come together and bring these playthings, these especially digital playthings, that are something more than just entertainment. There's something more significant going on in our engagement with play. And in fact, some people even refer to this as the ludic century, that we're in a time when games have actually moved into the mainstream of our entertainment and thinking consciousness. So that's a very interesting thing. So today I wanted to just give us some quick examples. You know, we don't have much time in the morning. I'm trying to set the stage for everybody, thinking about the ways that we can work together. I just want to tell you a little bit about what I do, and then I'll lay out the framework of my talk. In my work, I study how games can link us to history, to art history, to our own sense of human values in play. And I'm also an artist, and I use games and game-like strategies in my artwork as well. On the screen, you'll see a very large joystick. I'm kind of well known for this giant. It's called Giant Joystick. It's a sculpture that you can climb on and play Atari games. So I do a lot of things, playing around with scale and thinking about who gets to play and that kind of thing. And I also develop games. I've developed games since the 90s. I have a history developing. I was a digital game developer for a long time. And then about 6 years ago, I started doing paper-based games, board games, card games, and sports. So it's an interesting switch for me to move from the digital space into all kinds of spaces, including in-person games, performative games, and that kind of thing. Obviously, you know, like many people, I grew up, I grew up playing things like Dungeons and Dragons, which was invented down the road from where I grew up, and all kinds of board games with my family, card games, etc. And that interest has continued. But what's interesting for me is to think about ways in which games really represent something more than just a fantasy world or just some kind of fiction or some artificial framework for interacting with each other, but they actually convey who we are in an interesting way. Games are snapshots of who we are, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense of that as we move forward. First, I wanted to just talk about the power of play, just a big picture. How have we thought about this? You know, until very recently, and I'm talking, in the last 20 years, the only people really talking about games from a scholarly perspective, except for a Canadian philosopher, for example, were anthropologists. And in 1938, Dutch anthropologist Johan Huizinga wrote a book called Homo Ludens, Man Who Plays, and he actually came up with this idea of talking about play in the same language that he uses to talk about ritual, which is to say that there's a magic circle that happens when we enter the play space that we can that is the same kind of circle of buying into an experience that we have in religion, that we have in ritual, other kinds of experiences. Now, we're not talking about a Faustian circle on the ground necessarily. We could be talking about other kinds of play. We could be talking about literally the magic circle of playground play. What might look like child's play may also be something that adults do as well. And this is the new kind of magic circle that we have out in the world, right? So we enter into the play space through the phone screen. We're in the world, and we're also in a magic circle of some kind of sense. And so it's really interesting to me to think about how human values, enter the picture. And I've written a book on this with a philosopher, Helen Niesenbaum, and we think about, well, how can big picture, big ideas, like peace and equity and these lofty ideas that societies hold dear, do they enter games? How do they enter games, and how can we design for those? And it's really interesting when you look at successful games and that are kind of interesting and breaking a paradigm, like Pokemon Go. If you talk to the inventors, Satoshi Tajiri, he talks about he wanted to get players out in the world. He wanted to say, go out in the world and experience being in your body and being in the world. And that's a value, right? Like thinking about your own self in relationship to nature. So these are really interesting things. So when you really get to talking to someone about how the deep motivations, not the story and not the mechanics and all of these things, but what are those deep motivations that happen in games? And when we're designers, it's really great to think about those and talk to designers about that. And then if we're going to design games or work with people to design games, how can we tap into those larger big picture questions? So part of this fascination with games in this ludic century lie in this cultural hold. You know, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, because this is a global context, but I'm pretty sure that many of you know what this is, right? And you would know what Pokemon is, and Mario, and Angry Birds. And these are familiar icons that are as accessible to us as any characters from popular books, films, televisions, and now they're kind of all in the same universe of moving between game and book and everything else. We have a kind of transmedia universe in which all of our games are emerging. And then we have, you know, I know many families who communicate by playing Clash of Clans, or have communicated by playing Clash of Clans than they do talk on the telephone or even email or do any other kind of thing. So games provide this platform for connection in very deep ways with people one already knows. And I'm a real scholar of Paulo Freire, who is a pedagogical visionary, and he really is interested in how we work together to form our understanding of the universe, and how we mediate the world around us with each other is the way we kind of educate each other about who we are. And for me, it's a really inspirational idea to think about, well, if we're educating each other, what kind of space is that we want to be communicating? And that's where I end up getting into this idea of games for change. Some games can be used to just interest people in different notions of play, but there is a whole community of people in the last 10 years at least doing specifically a digital push online or in console games to make games that address specific social issues, raise awareness, and even change behavior or beliefs about particular issues. And here is just a sample of these things. Darfur is Dying is one of these games, which is a game that is a bigger game that cancer patients play and actually improve their regimen. They improve their health by sticking to the regimen of cancer. So there's a lot of data about what we can get out of our games. We're making games that address issues, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in less obvious ways. And they're really tackling real issues right now. A more recent example is the Half the Sky game that aimed to raise money and awareness for helping global women. So now there are all these aims with games for change. Change, if you say games for change, it means there's change. So how do you look at change? How do you measure change? And it's interesting, like other sectors of society have measurable things, right? Like food industry. This is, you know, some ketchup from some country. I don't know where that. I took this photo, but you know, you have these you know predictions on what this ketchup does to you, right? So do we have such a measurable thing for this game increases empathy, or this game raises awareness? You know, some of our measures are incomplete, and some of them, of course, it's hard to measure art. It's hard to measure experience, but there are, interestingly, some measurable qualities to games. And I just want to put this in context that video games with, you know, fan conventions and costume players and fictional portals, like are not just, you know, not just a media industry, not just a hobby. They're also entering museum space and gallery space. This was a show in 2012 at the Smithsonian Institution. The V&A has had video game shows. It's really, you know, there's this moment where games are being recognized as as high art instead of low art. And that means an interesting kind of lens that we can apply to the growing popularity and the discourse that we have around this. I want to just quote Brian Sutton Smith before I give you some really quick examples of how games maybe aren't as stereotypical as we might think. Brian Sutton Smith, an anthropologist and student of play, once noted we study play because life is crap. Life is crap, and it's full of pain and suffering, and the only thing that makes it worth living, the only thing that makes it possible to get up in the morning and go on living is play, art and play. So that's pretty visionary and interesting. Okay, so moving on. Stereotypes abound about games. When you think, we're all here and we might not have the same stereotypes that maybe pop culture has when journalists come and call me and ask me about games, but many stereotypes abound and they're not really accurate. Video games are still largely perceived as a domain for young white men, and this is pretty much wildly inaccurate. The average gamer, and this is United States data, the average gamer is 35 years old. 155 million people are playing video games in the United States alone. 4 out of 5 households own devices for playing video games. And female players constituted in 2016 41% of all game players. And you can see this, I have there's some interesting slide bars that you can go forward. It actually, in 2016, went down a little bit from 2014. It was at a real high at 2014. So we're almost at equity about gender and who's playing. So some of these stereotypes really don't make very much sense about, like, oh, it's a young white male thing, because there are actually more women over 55 playing video games than there are young men under 18 playing video games in the United States. So, you also have these kind of genres. Who are you playing with? Who are you playing with? And also, what kinds of games are you playing? So, projected growth of games worldwide, it's not about console games and about your AAA titles. The actual growth industries and the entire game industry is really focused on mobile, and mobile games tend to be smaller and more lightweight. So there's an interesting set of rethinking that has to go on. I have some economic data here for the EU. Well, for global data, but basically economic impact, this is in millions of US dollars. So Europe, we're averaging $2.5 to $7 billion market in most European countries. And in Ireland, it's interesting to see that 22% of the population is purchasing 1 to 2 video games a month. We can actually see what kind of games those are. So there's often this myth that first-person shooter games or action games are the most popular, and they're the legitimate games, and casual games are kind of not the serious games and they're far behind. But in fact, that's not the actual data that we have. People are playing a lot of casual games, and that is really a way in which we have to kind of recognize, wow, in a significant higher number of ways, why aren't we looking at those as interesting forms of art as well? So while women are playing far more games than you might think, and mobile and casual games are more prevalent than first-person shooters, the space of games, like the narratives, representations, things we see in the media, really keep this cycle of kind of making these stereotypes abound. And the stereotypes come back in the making. So for example, in 2009, there was a study that found that 85% of playable characters in games were male. So that doesn't match the demographic of who's actually playing games. Researchers have also found that characters depicted as black males are almost always violent. Minority females are virtually absent from games, except for Overwatch. So you have we have a lot of work to do in terms of thinking about not just representation, but who's making games and who's playing games. This is a really quick snapshot, and I don't have time to go into this, but I wanted to show you that in my research lab that I run at Dartmouth College, we make a lot of games for different social issues. They never look like the social issues we're trying to address. We have a particular technique called embedded design, where we sneak messages in that are pro-social in other contexts. So for example, here we have an interactive comic about space travel, but it's really underneath demonstrating bystander intervention for sexual assault prevention. It doesn't look like a serious sexual assault prevention game, and yet the same techniques can be used for that kind of training. We have a trivia game that looks like Trivia Crack. It's called Mind Flock. And you play this game, and it changes attitudes about sexual assault kind of in pop culture, like what constitutes sexual assault, and more like an information thing. Yet again, people playing it don't necessarily know that that's the point of the project. And this card game, I also do board games and card games. This card game, Buffalo, you play this game. It's a party game. It's really fun and fast-paced. And it actually, on measures of racism, which psychological studies that use these measures of racism, which is the Universal Orientation Scale, and I could go into details about this kind of the psych stuff. But we actually found that it raises certain ways that we can complexify identities, which means we're lowering racism, or at least racist tendencies, by playing the game. Interesting. So that games can actually have measurable impact that are pro-social is really great. I could do a whole talk on this, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to talk to you all about how youth workers can engage with games. I have just some really quick recommendations. Some of these you probably already do, but I wanted to just get it out there. So what I think is one thing that games can be, any game, use games to spark conversations about the creative process, planning, the design cycle, teamwork, and that's a great game to do this would be Minecraft. You know, how do you plan a new recreation? How do you, what are the rules for excellence and this kind of thing? Can you make a design team that's actually using Minecraft in an interesting way? Here's a second suggestion. Use games for constructive conversations about society and social values. And there are lots of interesting games that are provocative in this way. One is called Unmanned by Mole Industria, who's really an Italian designer. And he made this really low-tech technical game about being a drone pilot operator. So you actually play this guy as he's really bombing people. And it's this really disorienting, boring thing that has huge repercussions because it's really putting you in the position of rethinking what unmanned warfare would be like and is like, and it can be used as a conversation about violence. It's a violent game, but not in ways we normally talk about violence in games. You know, it's not about blood or whatever. Here's one. This is Manichi. It's a day in the life of being a transgender woman. It's a really interesting game that exposes a new perspective on just kind of a day in the life, choose your own adventure game. Gone Home, a first-person adventure exploration video game developed by the Fulbright Company. It's a game where you walk around and you explore a house, and in the house you start to uncover personal items and personal things, and eventually you uncover a story that has LGBTQ issues and kind of family alienation and all this stuff, but you're finding it in this house, in situation, right? So you can have really interesting conversations about love, about family life, about sexuality, and even counseling. There's some stuff in here. So, I think I have one more here, which is Papers, Please. Lucas Pope created this ominous game set in this fictional Soviet-era nation, Aristotska. And you play a border crossing guard, and you have to stamp passports and catch people sneaking through the border. If you accidentally let someone in who's not supposed to be in, sometimes those people are gunned down. So it's like, there's human trafficking happening in this game, and it's a really simple 8-bit game that the designer really was trying to make an interesting point. So discussing human trafficking, immigration, you can start with a game and then move into some big issues, right? So all very fascinating. I'll be really quick with my last few points. I'm interested in using someone's interest in one game to expand what they know. As a teacher, obviously, one of the ways that I think about teaching is I'm just exposing people to so many possibilities. You're trying to open up the gates and give people opportunities to learn. Often in games, I find that that's showing people that many things can be a game. Many kinds of things can be a game. Papers, Please won game of the year at several festivals, right? These games are not just like in the corner. In fact, big game companies look at these kinds of games for innovative ideas. So it's an interesting cycle that these small games that are taking on more radical issues feed up into the larger game industry. Often I'll face this, if I have really hardcore gamers who are like, if it's not something like Call of Duty, I'm not playing it. I have to have, my, something. So what I often do is find interviews with game designers from the big companies where people are already fans, find interviews with them on YouTube, or even Skype people into my classroom and say, okay, yes, you worked on Call of Duty, but now you're doing your own project. What is it? And try to get them to talk about their favorite games, because often their favorite games are not necessarily the stereotype also. So that's really a way to kind of use the legitimacy of AAA title people or big game companies to start to open up what games can be for players who might not have as many experiences. And it's really important, I think, to try making games, because everyone loves being a fan, but when you become a producer of games, you actually start to learn how to model systems, how to really make decisions, how to abstract problems. And one of the things I'm really interested in that games are so powerful with doing is really that we can model problems. So why do we not model new kinds of problem solving and new kinds of solutions? I'm kind of tired of, I live in the United States, I'm kind of tired of people solving problems with guns, It trickles out. I'm not a blamer of video games, I'm not a blamer of media, but we do have a culture in which we solve problems with guns. So, maybe there are other ways to solve problems. And so I want to make games that do that. It's an interesting question. Rather than condemn all games I don't like or I think could be improved, I want to innovate, and I want to make something that can really change the world for the better. So here are my points that I'm here to share with you. Sparking conversations, using people's interests, helping learners move from being fans to being producers. This is all very interesting to me. And then if I'm allowed, I just wanted to end with a really quick note for our context here. I am not Irish, as you can tell from a variety of factors, but now. But games are ancient. I find it really inspirational to know about the history of games. When I found this, I was looking and writing my book, Critical Play, and I was like, well, what is the oldest board game? What is it? And anthropologists think that, or archaeologists think that they have found board games from 6000 BC. Now, 6000 BC is before human written language. Now, how cool is that? That games and literally board games could be older by thousands of years than humans' ability to write their language. What does that mean about the way we think about the world and our connecting to our own spirituality and our own circumstance? And I do want to point out that there's this huge history of Celtic games, many of which I don't even know, but I know that there's some really interesting games represented here, and I'm going to not even say that right. I think it's Fitchel. Is it Fitchel? Wood Wisdom? Anyway, that wooden thing is from the 9th century. And it was actually supposed to be invented by, I'm going to say this wrong too, Lu, the Irish god of light. Yeah, so he's supposed to have invented a game. That's really great. Anyway, cool. And even over in Scotland on the Isle of Lewis, there was this Viking ship that crashed off the Isle of Lewis, and all these games were taken into this cave, and there were these chessboards, and it was the stash of chessboards were called the chessboards, the Isle of Lewis chessboards. You may have seen them in the British Museum or in the National Museum in Scotland, and it's the first set of boards that actually have the queen as a woman on them, because there was no queen in the initial chess set, and chess evolved through time. We think that chess was just birthed, but there are many variations of chess, and the first ones were actually found on the Isle of Lewis and carved in Norway. So anyway, there's this interesting stuff, and if we had more time, I would tell you about case studies and different games that have been developed. But what I really want to just make sure that I leave you with is that both popular games, independent games, really big titles, very interesting titles, and even historic board games can be used for inspiration for when we're working with ourselves and with teams of people. And I wanted to thank you for the invitation today, and I'll be around in various guises, apparently. I'll just be around. So maybe lunch if you want to look at data. I have data. Yeah, all that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to Mary Flanagan. That was very interesting. Next, we will have Simon Johnson from Free Ice Cream. And we might have the 3 guest speakers, if it's okay, to come up and sit down there for if anybody has any further questions, if that's okay at the very end. Thank you.
you.